Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. If you think the political situation in our world right now is bad, try being alive during the last days of the Republic. It would have been a far more terrifying situation. Just 3 years earlier, the beginning of the Clone Wars had shocked the galaxy, which had been at peace for almost 1,000 years, and now the Galactic Republic, which had governed and created structure for trillions of beings for tens of thousands of years, was suddenly gone. And all of this occurs because one single Sith Lord manages to infiltrate their way into the Republic Senate.
Give immediately emergency powers to the Supreme Chancellor.
Sorry.
Oh, say yes! Right, Palpy. You manipulated me. Okay, Papi.
If you guys ever figure out the whole time travel thing, that's the guy you go back and kill. Now, in our last video, we took a look at the average day of a stormtrooper.
I must be destroyed.
And today we're going to be doing something kind of similar. We're going to take a look at what the average citizen's experience was during the collapse of the Republic and the rise of the Empire. Now, granted, not everyone's experience was the same. This was very much a tale of two regions, the Outer Rim and the Core, a geographic divide that has existed far before the Empire ever came into power. In today's video, we're only going to be covering the Outer Rim. We'll do the Core region in our next video, and that's because even in the Outer Rim, there were different economic and political relationships that determined whether your experience was either terrible or horrible. For most of galactic history, the Outer Rim laid undeveloped and impoverished. This was mainly because of Sith Lords, those damn hyperspace whales, the Nile Marauders. They're all driving away that much needed capital investment. Without capital investment, you couldn't develop infrastructure large enough for a bigger settlement. Without a bigger settlement, you don't have enough tax money to support a security force. And without a security force to protect everything, you just end up in a ruthless cycle of getting raided and pillaged and then wallowing in poverty. That's the Fire. Now, the Free Trade Zone was established by the Republic in an attempt to kind of change the situation. But what it actually did was it attracted those mega conglomerates that not only had Senate representation, they were also ruthlessly chasing profits and enforcing their will on the people of the Outer Rim, where there were basically no checks and balances to stop them. The Trade Federation controlled all of the logistics and shipping of the area, and so they price gouged consumers. They made factory workers pay for products at 10 times the rate that people in the core would, products that most likely were made by these factory workers. And this wasn't just about greed, it was also about enslaving these people with debt. It's basically what the Zygerians did to people. The only difference is the Trade Federation could also label their new corporate slaves on their spreadsheets for the quarterly reports to their shareholders. That's the frying pan. The charismatic Count Dooku started tapping into the frustrations of the people in the Outer Rim, but instead of turning their anger against the corporations, he turned them against the Republic, and thus started the Separatist Crisis and Clone Wars. The sad thing is, the people of the Outer Rim didn't realize that the very corporations that were exploiting them were also leading their new faction, the Confederacy of Independent Systems. As a matter of fact, all of those dickhead corporate leaders were sitting on the Separatist High Council. That is the oven. And when the Clone Wars finally ended with the Separatists defeated, they never really stood a chance. The Republic came in and occupied the Outer Rim. That is the slow cooker. So to understand what life was like for individuals living in the Outer Rim during the rise of the Empire, you need to understand two things. First, Palpatine did not give a crap about these people. All he really wanted was their resources, their land, their manpower, and what other scraps he could steal from them. The only thing that really holds vicious animals like Emperor Palpatine back is the power that individuals wield. Dictators, Sith Lords, YouTube, crypto pushers, they only understand the threat of violence and force. Which comes to the second thing you need to understand. There was very little power in the Outer Rim. Economically, politically, and even culturally speaking, this was a forgotten region of the galaxy. Even during the Republic era, at best, people sort of just forgot that the Outer Rim existed, which is still better than how the Empire would exploit this part of the galaxy. The Outer Rim starts the Imperial period off in a very bad position. The majority of the Clone Wars, a fake conflict cooked up by the Sith to destroy the Jedi and Republic, took place in the Outer Rim. This was mainly because most of the Sith's assets and holdings, most of the valuable infrastructure in the galaxy, was in the core and not in the Outer Rim. And so the Outer Rim, which already suffered from thousands of years of neglect, saw what little infrastructure and industry they had left completely destroyed. In the last year of the war, the Republic carried out a massive operation to bottle up and destroy the remaining Separatist strongholds and armies. This was known as the Outer Rim Siege period. This included operations on worlds like Onderon, Selachii, Araxis, Kaller, and Ryloth. It's actually a brilliant move by Darth Sidious, if you think about it. These sieges allowed the Republic to engage specific planets so that at the end of the war, the Empire already had troops on these specific planets. And so when Palpatine took over complete control of the galaxy, he didn't actually need to invade these places for their industrial infrastructure and raw resources because he was already there. Now, there were a few different scenarios playing on all of these Outer Rim worlds during the rise of the New Order, some worse than others. You had worlds like Raxus Secundus, the heart of the Confederacy, where the CIS Parliament and High Council met. This world had been the capital of the former Separatist movement. Now, the Empire in this early period was still relatively benign. It was held in check by certain things like the Imperial Senate, even though they turned a blind eye to a lot of things that Palpatine did. The massacre of a crowd of Separatists on Raxus Secundus could create a huge political issue for Palpatine. And so at first, the Empire tried to play nice whenever people were looking. They would send Imperial officers like Captain Bragg on Raxus Secundus to find local leaders that could serve as puppets for the Imperial regime. And it was kind of difficult to find such people, especially on Separatist worlds. I mean, Seppies are very proud people. And by the time one Senator, Avi Singh, was given the option to become the puppet leader of his people, the Empire had already tried to make this arrangement with many different officials and discarded them all. Avi Singh would ultimately do the same thing.
Fellow citizens, I implore you to embrace these new laws. Under the Empire, Raxus will flourish once more. And as your senator, I promise
This wasn't just about doing what's right politically. I mean, keep in mind, Avi Singh didn't actually understand the depths of the Empire's evil at the time. And more importantly, the war had been long and tough for many of his constituents. Avi Singh understood that he must tread carefully with the Empire or risk plunging the planet into a conflict once again. But ultimately, his conscience does not allow him to serve as a puppet for the Empire.
It is my duty to act in your best interest, and it is why I can no longer condone this unjust occupation.
The crowd's reaction is loud and roaring, which is, typical for a world like this. The people of the Outer Rim are proud and rebellious by nature, and I think many here saw the Empire as just a continuation of the Republic. The optics of the clones and the all-trained tactical enforcers definitely didn't stir up any hope or peace in their minds. Worlds like this would be the first to burn. Things would always escalate, but the Empire in those days rarely made the first move, especially when the holo cameras were watching. They would just continue to push and push, remove liberties from the local population until someone snaps. The second that one insurgent tosses a detonator or shoots a trooper, all bets are off and a crackdown begins. The Empire also really didn't trust former Separatist worlds, and this was reflected in their recruitment strategy. They really relied on Outer Rim manpower to fill in the ranks, but they gave very few slots to former Separatist worlds to the Academy system. This is where a lot of high-ranking officers were trained. So they wanted Separatists for cannon fodder, but not necessarily to serve as officers where they could have political power. Now, generally speaking, whatever industrial or raw resource manufacturing capabilities a planet had was usually taken over once the Empire arrived. A lot of times the Empire would just claim that they were helping them rebuild or, directing their operations to become more profitable, but these were hostile takeovers. Sometimes this, of course, did mean turning on old facilities and the construction of new factories and mines, and for a short time, it did benefit people on certain worlds. But at the same time, the Empire would also become the only employer on said planets, and a lot of these operations would destroy entire economies and make them very heavily weighted towards one resource and one commodity, which, of course, is not good for any nation. But then you would have worlds like Ryloth, where the relationship between the Republic and the local people was actually quite good at the end of the war. During the Clone Wars, Techno-Union Emir Wat Tambor had done terrible things to the Twi'lek people. Ryloth was a rough and wild planet, and an occupying force could only really control the major settlements, cities like Lesu, the capital. And so when the Separatists arrived, they tried to blockade the planet and starve it into submission. Yet Twi'lek partisans wouldn't give up. They would start attacking Separatist operations. And so in turn, Wat Tambor would start taking civilians as hostages, and finally, he would start bombing occupied villages, killing thousands of innocent people. The Clone Army and the Jedi had fought hard to first try and repel that initial Separatist invasion. They failed at the time, but the Twi'lek remembered how the Republic soldiers fought to the last man, allowing Cham Syndulla and his Twi'lek resistance movement to survive and grow stronger until further Republic reinforcements came. And it was the Twi'leks and the clones together who would take back the planet from the Separatists. Now, with the war over, the Twi'leks, who were usually suspicious of outsiders, were tolerant of the clones. And that's because, unlike Raxus, Ryloth had very little economic development. There were very little opportunities on this planet. Their main exports were slaves and spice. They were also an independent planet, mind you. They weren't a part of the Republic or the Confederacy, and later on they would be a part of the Hutts. And so even a few battalions of clones right now brought in much needed credits to the local economy. And the Empire's agenda when they came to Ryloth was simple. They wanted to disarm all of the various partisan groups that had banded together to fight off the Separatists. The Empire would do this. They would pass this policy through one of the local Twi'lek leaders, who was called Cham Syndulla. He was actually one of the major leaders of the resistance.
My friends, I understand your uneasiness. The one thing we have always done as a people is stand together to defend Ryloth. When the Clone War began and the Republic was losing, we were on our own.
The idea of giving up their weapons so soon was not a popular idea. Many Twi'leks had suffered greatly during this conflict.
But when our losses mounted and the enemy closed in, the Clone Army came to our aid. We would not be here today if it wasn't for them. They fought with us. They fought for us. And they have earned our respect.
But Cham Syndulla also understood that, like on every planet across the galaxy, people were tired of fighting and dying. They just wanted to get on with their lives.
I trust them to protect us as they always have. The war has ended. Let us lay down our weapons and focus on Ryloth's future.
What the Empire didn't really understand was that the Empire was here for a gigantic Dunium deposit that had been unearthed beneath the surface of the planet. This was a material that they needed for the construction of the Death Star's laser system. What the Twi'lek also didn't realize was that the Empire was already sending out dropships full of stormtroopers to basically raid remote settlements of Twi'leks that were completely disconnected from the rest of the planet. I mean, a lot of these people didn't even know that the Clone Wars had started or ended. These individuals would be pressed into slave labor and forced to work in the Empire's refineries on the planet. And very soon, the Twi'lek people probably wished that they hadn't thrown down their weapons, as the entire planet would be occupied. And this was happening all across the galaxy. You know, however bad things were during the Clone Wars, things would only get worse during Imperial rule. In some cases, like on Desix, you still had Separatist holdouts protected by droid forces that had not given up after the entire Confederacy had collapsed. These areas hoped foolishly to remain undisturbed and were quickly the focus of lightning-fast Imperial raids. The leaders of such holdouts did not understand that even though they had no wider political aspirations to spread their movements, it was just unacceptable for them to exist. It was a slight to Emperor Palpatine, and some of these individuals were naive and foolish enough to think that they could negotiate with the clone death squads that were sent to take them out.
Listen, we both lived through one war. Let's not start another. Too many people have died already. We can resolve this without more bloodshed.
Some clones were naive enough to think they weren't actually in a death squad.
Please, do this for your people.
A lot of these Separatist holdout leaders hoped that at least, their people wouldn't get punished, that they would be able to continue living a relatively normal life.
Nicely handled. Now execute her.
Sir, I promised a peaceful—
You did, I didn't. Now execute her. Follow it, or face the consequences for disobedience!
But what they failed to realize was no one had less power in the galaxy than a Separatist leading a holdout. These Separatist holdouts really had no other choice but to fight to the death. And that's because no matter what the Empire did to these people, the only people who witnessed these events, these raids, were Imperials, and they could pretty much make up whatever they wanted to. The second the Separatists fired on the Empire, that made everyone on Desix the enemy, and no one really cares what happens to the enemy. On Onderon, after the Empire annexed the planet, the Empire would try to press Saw Gerrera's partisans into service into the Imperial Army, and, as you can imagine, that did not end up well. Saw Gerrera would launch another insurgency, and this time, perhaps without his sister, Saw would get completely crushed, and the Empire would ruthlessly pursue not only his men, but the civilians that got caught up in the fighting and supported their movement.
Where's Gerrera?
I don't know, but I wouldn't tell you if I did.
I believe you.
And this time it wasn't just combatants getting murdered, the civilians were open targets as well, something that shocked even the Imperials sent on these missions.
Finish the mission.
If there's one thing that's worse than just a normal enemy, it's an enemy that uses terrorist tactics. As you can see, it was the trauma of the previous war that allowed the Empire to so quickly take over and oppress the Outer Rim. Now, the consequences of these actions would eventually emerge. It wasn't a coincidence that a lot of the early rebel factions would form in the Outer Rim. A lot of them were actually former Separatists as well, like Cassian Andor, a son of Ferrix who would one day play a huge role in defeating the Empire. Even Saw Gerrera would remain around for another decade or so, constantly attacking Imperial bases and supply lines. Other worlds like Ferrix, like Lothal, would have their tango with the Empire. It wasn't a matter of if, but when the Empire had time and resources to finally escalate the situation. And that is what the Empire always did. They needlessly escalated the situation and made maintaining security a lot tougher in a lot of cases. Instead of carrying out a mining operation in Lothal that could have been beneficial and brought wealth to the local population, the Empire would decide to steal land from the local farmers to build their mines and then put them into shanty towns hilariously named Tarkin towns. For all you American history buffs out there, you might understand the reference towards Hoovervilles here. And the more the Empire pushed Lothal, the more the rebels pushed back until the conflict sent one of the most talented Imperial officers in the Navy, Thrawn, to the other side of the galaxy. The story on Ferrix was also one of unnecessary engagement and escalation. You see, whether you're an evil dictator or a beloved, benevolent elected official, taking care of your constituents, your subjects, is the most important part of your job. Do not be fooled by the individual weakness of the masses, for together they make the nation that you rule. And if you aren't questioning what the daily experience of the average citizen is in your nation, then you're not doing your job properly. And very soon you'll probably find your head on a spike. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.